When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and the smoke cleared over the ruins of Nazi Germany, the victorious Allied powers found themselves facing a question that nobody had fully prepared for. What do you do with the architects of the deadliest conflict in human history? The men who had plunged the world into darkness were now sitting in Allied prison cells, awaiting judgment. Names like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop would soon become synonymous with the Nuremberg trials, where the world would witness an unprecedented attempt to hold war criminals accountable for their actions. But there was another group of prisoners that presented a far more complicated problem, one that history has largely forgotten. These were the wives of the top-ranking Nazis, women who had stood beside some of the most evil men of the 20th century, women who had shared their beds, raised their children, and enjoyed the spoils of a regime built on persecution and death. Women like Margarete Himmler, whose husband Heinrich commanded the dreaded SS and oversaw the machinery of the Holocaust. Women like Emmy Göring, who was known as the First Lady of the Third Reich and lived a life of unimaginable luxury while millions suffered. The question that haunted investigators was deceptively simple but impossibly difficult to answer. Had these women committed crimes? Could they be held responsible for the horrors their husbands had unleashed upon the world? And if they were guilty, how could anyone prove it in a court of law? The answer, as history would reveal, was deeply unsatisfying. In the chaotic years following the war, most of the top Nazi wives walked away without facing any meaningful punishment. Some were questioned and released within days. Others were never investigated at all. A few managed to hold on to fortunes built on stolen property, valuables ripped from the homes of Jewish families who were then sent to die in concentration camps. These women had benefited enormously from unimaginable suffering, yet they would live out their remaining years in relative comfort, some even becoming wealthy from books they wrote defending their husbands' reputations. How did this happen? How did the wives of history's greatest monsters escape the justice that their husbands faced? The reasons are complicated, and they reveal uncomfortable truths about the limitations of international law, the assumptions people held about women in the 1940s, and the sheer overwhelming chaos that followed the collapse of the Third Reich. When Allied forces swept into Germany in the final months of the war, they had their hands full. The country was in ruins. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions of refugees were streaming across the continent. And sitting in prison camps across the occupied zones were tens of thousands of potential war criminals. The Allies had to make difficult decisions about where to focus their limited resources, and they made a choice that would have lasting consequences. They decided to concentrate on officials with direct command responsibility. The Nuremberg trials were designed to target people who had held positions of authority, who had signed orders, who had directed policy, who had run the institutions that made the Holocaust possible. The prosecutors wanted defendants who had committed crimes through their chain of command or with their own hands. By this standard, most of the Nazi wives simply did not qualify. They held no official positions. They commanded no troops. They signed no deportation orders. They ran no concentration camps. In the rigid hierarchy of Nazi Germany, women were deliberately kept away from the levers of power. This was not an accident. Adolf Hitler had very specific ideas about the role of women in his thousand-year Reich, and those ideas did not include positions of authority or influence over government policy. Nazi ideology celebrated women as mothers and homemakers, the nurturers of the Aryan race, not as leaders or decision-makers. The only woman who held anything resembling a high-ranking position in the Nazi government was Gertrude Schultz-Klink, who led the various women's organizations, but even she had virtually no influence over actual policy. Hitler kept his own relationship with Eva Braun so secret that most Germans had no idea who she was. She was hidden away, a private pleasure kept separate from the public image of the Führer as a man married only to Germany. Magda Goebbels, despite being perhaps Hitler's closest female confidant and someone he genuinely admired, held no formal position whatsoever. Her husband Joseph was the propaganda minister, one of the most powerful men in the Reich, but Magda herself was officially nothing more than a devoted wife and mother. Even Margarete Himmler, whose husband controlled the SS and the entire apparatus of terror that enforced Nazi rule, was not involved in her husband's work. She served as a nurse in the German Red Cross, a position that, while it reflected her ideological commitment to the Nazi cause, gave her no authority over the crimes her husband was committing. This created an enormous legal problem for anyone who wanted to hold these women accountable. Being married to a war criminal, no matter how monstrous that war criminal might be, was not itself a crime under international law. The prosecutors at Nuremberg needed evidence of direct involvement in criminal acts. They needed proof that someone had signed documents ordering deportations. They needed witnesses who could testify that someone had given commands that resulted in deaths. They needed evidence that someone had personally abused prisoners or organized the theft of property. Without this kind of concrete proof, there was simply no legal basis for prosecution, no matter how morally complicit these women might have been. Consider the case of Hedwig Höss, the wife of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. If any Nazi wife could have been held accountable for crimes, it should have been her. She lived with her husband and children in a comfortable villa just outside the walls of the most notorious death camp in history. From her garden, she could see the chimneys of the crematoria. The prisoners who worked as slaves in her household were people awaiting death, and after the war, testimony emerged suggesting that she and her children had mistreated these prisoners. Yet Hedwig Höss was never charged with any crime. She was interrogated extensively by Allied investigators following her husband's arrest, but eventually she was simply released. She was allowed to build a new life for herself, to fade into anonymity, to escape any consequences for having been the wife of a man responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people. The evidence against her was anecdotal. Survivors told stories, but stories were not enough. The legal standards of the time required more concrete proof, and that proof did not exist in any form that could be presented in a courtroom. This pattern repeated itself again and again. Many of the Nazi wives were true believers, women who had embraced the ideology of racial supremacy and who had encouraged their husbands in their work. Many of them were the beneficiaries of stolen property, living in homes filled with artwork and valuables that had been taken from Jewish families. But proving active participation in these crimes to the standard required by law was extraordinarily difficult. These women could claim, often truthfully, that they had never personally stolen anything, that they had no idea where their furniture or paintings had come from, that they were simply innocent recipients of gifts from their husbands. Even if everyone knew they were lying, even if it was obvious that they had to have known, proving it was another matter entirely. Moral guilt and legal guilt are not the same thing, and in the aftermath of World War II, many women who were deeply morally guilty would escape legal punishment because no prosecutor could prove their crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. There was also a deeper problem, one that reflects the assumptions and prejudices of the era. Allied investigators, almost all of whom were men, systematically underestimated the role that women had played in the Nazi state. They assumed that women were apolitical, that they simply followed their husbands, that they were incapable of participating in large-scale crimes, and that they had no real influence on Nazi policy. These assumptions were wrong, but they were widespread, and they shaped the decisions that investigators made about who to pursue and who to ignore. Some of the Nazi wives had been deeply involved in promoting the regime. They had appeared in propaganda materials. They had stood beside their husbands at rallies and official functions. Some had helped raise money for the Nazi Party in its early days, when every donation mattered. But these activities were dismissed as the harmless contributions of supportive wives, not the actions of political actors who deserved scrutiny. Emmy Göring was perhaps the most striking example of this phenomenon. She had been a famous actress before marrying Hermann Göring, and after the war, she successfully portrayed herself as exactly what people expected her to be, a vain and harmless woman who had simply been dazzled by her powerful husband. In reality, Emmy Göring had accumulated a fortune in stolen artwork and property during the years of Nazi rule. Her husband was one of the most prolific art thieves in history, and the treasures he gathered, paintings ripped from the walls of Jewish collectors, sculptures taken from museums across occupied Europe, ended up decorating their palatial homes. Emmy knew exactly where these objects came from. She could not possibly have been ignorant, but she maintained her pose of innocent ignorance, and investigators, predisposed to see her as nothing more than a trophy wife, largely accepted her story. She faced some consequences after the war. She spent time in detention. She lost some of her property. But she was never prosecuted for crimes related to the stolen artwork, and she lived out the rest of her life in relative comfort, dying in 1973 without ever being held truly accountable for her role in one of the greatest theft operations in history. The case of Lina Heydrich illustrates how difficult it was to connect the wives to their husbands' crimes, even when the connection seemed obvious. Reinhard Heydrich was one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany, a man so brutal that he was known as the Butcher of Prague and the Man with the Iron Heart. He was a primary architect of the Holocaust, the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference where the final solution was planned. And according to many accounts, it was Lina who first encouraged him to join the Nazi Party, who pushed him toward the path that would make him one of history's greatest monsters. After Heydrich was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in 1942, Lina lived an incredibly grand lifestyle on the proceeds of her husband's crimes. There is a chilling story about her from this period. When her son was struck by a truck, she allegedly demanded that everyone in the vehicle, the driver and all the passengers, be dragged out and shot on the spot. This was the kind of person she was, someone who believed that her status as the widow of Reinhard Heydrich entitled her to absolute power over the lives of others. Yet after the war, prosecuting Lina proved nearly impossible. How do you charge someone with encouraging their spouse to join a political party? How do you prove in a court of law that a wife's influence over her husband led to specific criminal acts? The chain of causation was too long, too diffuse, too impossible to document with the kind of evidence that courts require. Lina Heydrich spent the rest of her life denying the Holocaust and defending her husband's reputation. She claimed he had nothing to do with the final solution, that he was a patriot and a hero who had been misunderstood by history. She was tried in absentia by a Czechoslovak court and sentenced to life imprisonment, but she never returned to Czech territory to serve that sentence, and no one made her. Instead, she was allowed to run a guest house that had belonged to her husband, turning it into a restaurant that she operated until her death in 1985. She even won the legal right to receive a pension as the widow of a high-ranking German police general killed in action, though the government initially declined to pay it. Here was a woman who had encouraged her husband to become a Nazi, who had lived in occupied territory while he terrorized the population, who had denied the Holocaust until her dying breath, and she spent her final decades running a restaurant and fighting for pension benefits. It is a bitter testament to the limitations of post-war justice. The Allies also simply had too much to do and too few resources to do it with. The scale of the task facing the occupation authorities was staggering. They had to screen millions of Germans through denazification proceedings. They had thousands of officials to interrogate. They had hundreds of concentration camp guards, Gestapo officers, and SS members to prosecute. They had to rebuild a shattered country while simultaneously preparing for what was becoming an increasingly dangerous confrontation with the Soviet Union. In this context, the Nazi wives were a relatively low priority. American investigators preparing the Dachau trials, for example, made an early decision to focus on individuals directly connected with running the camp, not on their spouses or casual visitors. Every hour spent investigating a Nazi wife was an hour not spent building cases against camp commandants and guards. The choices were understandable, even if the results were frustrating. Some of the most prominent Nazi wives died before any investigation could even begin. Eva Braun, who became Eva Hitler in a brief ceremony in the bunker beneath Berlin just hours before the end, died alongside her new husband on April 30th, 1945. She swallowed a cyanide capsule while he shot himself in the head. Their bodies were burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, and whatever secrets she might have revealed died with her. Magda Goebbels made an even more horrifying choice. After poisoning her 6 children because she could not bear the thought of them living in a world without National Socialism, she and her husband took their own lives. Gerda Bormann, the wife of Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, was in a hospital in Italy when the war ended. She was suffering from cancer, and she died before any investigation into her activities could take place. In each case, death robbed the Allies of the opportunity to ask questions and seek answers. There was one Nazi wife who did face repeated prosecution, and her case shows both the possibilities and the limitations of post-war justice. Ilse Koch was the wife of Karl Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp. The accusations against her were horrifying. Survivors claimed she had ordered prisoners killed. There were persistent rumors that she possessed lampshades and other items made from the tattooed skin of murdered inmates. She was so notorious that even the SS had investigated her during the war, and her husband had been executed by the Nazis themselves for corruption and murder. After the war, the Allies tried Ilse Koch multiple times, but they struggled to settle on an appropriate sentence. Her convictions were overturned and reinstated. Her sentence was reduced and then increased. Eventually, she was convicted of incitement to grievous bodily harm, incitement to attempted murder, and incitement to murder. These charges suggest a template that might have been applied to other Nazi wives, a recognition that even without direct command authority, someone could be held responsible for encouraging and inciting the crimes of others. But Ilse Koch was an exceptional case, a woman whose cruelty was so extreme and so well documented that she could not be ignored. Most of the Nazi wives, who had been more discreet in their complicity, escaped this kind of scrutiny. Many of the Nazi wives who survived the war became skilled at portraying themselves as victims. They claimed they had been misled, that they were helpless housewives who stayed home while their husbands committed terrible crimes, that they were themselves victims of brutal and controlling men who gave them no choice. Some claimed they had been trapped in their marriages and could not escape. These narratives found a receptive audience in post-war Germany, a society that was itself struggling to come to terms with collective guilt. In a country filled with rubble and refugees, where millions were homeless and hungry, there was genuine sympathy for widows, even the widows of war criminals. Emmy Göring insisted she was just an actress who knew nothing of her husband's activities. Margarete Himmler presented herself as a concerned nurse and devoted mother, not a Nazi. The fact that these claims were largely false did not prevent them from being effective. Some of the Nazi wives even managed to profit from their notoriety. In the decades after the war, several wrote memoirs that became bestsellers in Germany and beyond. These books allowed them to shape their own narratives, to present themselves as they wished to be seen, and to earn substantial sums of money in the process. The wives of monsters became authors and minor celebrities, their infamy transformed into a marketable commodity. It is perhaps the final insult to their victims, that these women not only escaped punishment, but found ways to profit from their connection to some of history's greatest crimes. The failure to prosecute the Nazi wives reflects a broader truth about the limitations of law in the face of unprecedented evil. The legal systems that existed in 1945 were designed to handle individual crimes committed by individual perpetrators. They were not designed to address the kind of systemic, bureaucratic, industrialized murder that the Nazis had perfected. They were certainly not designed to hold accountable the wives and families who had benefited from that system without directly participating in its most obvious crimes. The Nuremberg trials were a remarkable achievement, an attempt to establish the principle that individuals could be held responsible for crimes against humanity. But they could only do so much. They could prosecute the men who had signed the orders and run the camps. They could not easily reach the women who had encouraged those men, who had enjoyed the fruits of their crimes, who had looked the other way while millions died. Denazification courts did hand down some minor sentences to Nazi wives. Some spent brief periods in detention. Some lost a percentage of their wealth. But these punishments were trivial compared to the magnitude of their moral complicity. The women who had lived at the very heart of Nazi power, who had dined with Hitler and Himmler and Heydrich, who had worn jewelry stolen from the murdered and hung paintings looted from the dispossessed, these women largely walked away untouched by any meaningful justice. They lived out their lives in the new Germany that rose from the ashes of the old, their pasts gradually fading from public memory. Some remarried. Some started businesses. Some became respected members of their communities. The crimes of their husbands became history, studied in schools and commemorated in museums, while the wives themselves became footnotes, their complicity quietly forgotten. This history matters because it forces us to confront difficult questions about guilt, responsibility, and justice. How do we hold people accountable for benefiting from evil, even when they did not directly commit evil acts themselves? How do we judge those who encouraged and enabled crimes without directly carrying them out? How do we balance the practical limitations of legal systems against our moral intuition that wrongdoing should be punished? The Nazi wives were not innocent. They knew what was happening. Many of them supported it enthusiastically. All of them benefited from it. But the systems of justice that existed at the time were not equipped to hold them accountable, and so most of them escaped. It is a sobering reminder that law and justice are not always the same thing, and that sometimes the guilty walk free not because they are innocent, but because their guilt takes forms that our legal systems cannot easily address. The story of the Nazi wives is ultimately a story about the spaces between guilt and innocence, between moral responsibility and legal culpability. These women lived in a gray zone that the post-war world struggled to navigate. They were not the architects of the Holocaust, but they were its beneficiaries. They did not sign the deportation orders, but they lived in homes furnished with stolen goods. They did not run the concentration camps, but they raised families within sight of the crematoria. The justice system that emerged from World War II was designed to punish the most obvious perpetrators, the men who gave the orders and pulled the triggers. It was never designed to reach everyone who was complicit in making the Third Reich possible, and so many of those people, including many of the women who shared the lives and the crimes of the top Nazis, escaped into the anonymity of the post-war world. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not to relitigate trials that never happened, but to remind us of how difficult it is to achieve justice in the aftermath of great evil, and how many people can escape accountability when crimes are committed on a scale that overwhelms the capacity of any legal system to address them.